Imagine being just 6 years old and already holding a real weapon, not a toy sword, not a stick, but cold iron meant to draw blood. In Viking society, childhood wasn't about games, fairy tales, or protection from the dangers of the world. Childhood was preparation. Preparation for war, for survival, and for killing. If you were born in the Viking Age, you weren't a child for long. From the moment you could walk, you were expected to help the family, carry wood, tend animals, and endure the brutal Scandinavian winters. But for boys especially, and sometimes even for girls, childhood was also about being forged into warriors. Hollywood often shows us Viking children running happily through the fjords, playing with wooden swords and laughing around the fire. The truth is far darker. Viking children were drilled, hardened, and exposed to violence from the moment they could hold a blade. By the time they turned 10, many were already capable of killing. And not just capable, they were expected to. In this video, we're going to strip away the myth and uncover the shocking reality of Viking childhood training. From weapon practice and brutal initiation rituals to real battle experience before adulthood, this is the story of how Viking kids were raised to kill before most modern kids even learn multiplication. Part 1. Born into a world of violence. The Viking world was not a safe one. Life expectancy was short, diseases were rampant, winters were deadly, and raiding was a constant threat. From the very beginning, Viking children grew up in a society where violence was normal, expected, and even celebrated. Unlike today, where children are often shielded from war and brutality, Viking kids lived side by side with it. When raids happened, they saw prisoners dragged home in chains. They saw bloodied warriors returning from battle, and they listened to sagas told around the fire, not fairy tales, but epic violent stories of heroes who killed dozens of enemies with axes and swords. This wasn't entertainment, it was indoctrination. These stories weren't meant to soothe children, they were meant to shape them, to make them admire strength, courage, and above all else, killing. And so, childhood in the Viking world wasn't an escape from reality. It was a constant rehearsal for it. By the age of 5 or 6, Viking boys were often introduced to weapons training. Wooden swords, spears, and bows weren't toys for fun. They were scaled-down tools meant to teach muscle memory. Little boys were expected to mimic the stances of their fathers, the thrust of a spear, the draw of a bowstring. It wasn't play, it was practice for survival. Part 2. Early training with real weapons. By 7 or 8 years old, training escalated. At this age, Viking boys were already expected to handle real weapons. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking children's graves sometimes contained small but fully functional swords, spears, and shields, not ceremonial replicas, but real tools of war. Imagine an 8-year-old gripping a heavy axe, struggling with its weight until his muscles adapted. The point wasn't comfort, it was toughness. Viking kids had to push past pain to get used to bruises, cuts, and exhaustion. And they didn't practice alone. Older warriors, fathers, uncles, and even seasoned raiders often supervised the children. They drilled them in strikes, shield blocks, and spear thrusts. They taught them how to kill quickly, how to finish a downed opponent, and how to use the shield wall formation. The training wasn't just physical, it was mental. Viking children were taught not to flinch at blood. Sometimes they were even brought to animal sacrifices, forced to watch and sometimes participate in the killing of goats, pigs, or horses. This was no accident. It was training, teaching children that blood, violence, and death were part of life. Part 3. Games that were really combat training. What looked like games were often combat drills in disguise. Viking children played competitive games like Natleaker, a kind of brutal ball game that mixed rugby, hockey, and wrestling. There were no referees, no safety rules, and often the games ended with blood on the snow. Wrestling, too, was a core part of Viking childhood. Boys wrestled constantly, both for fun and for training. These weren't harmless schoolyard tussles. Viking wrestling emphasized strength, chokeholds, joint locks, and throws that could easily break bones. Through these games, Viking kids learned aggression, endurance, and dominance. They were taught that losing wasn't just embarrassing, it was unacceptable. The sagas are filled with stories of boys mocked for weakness or shamed if they couldn't win fights. Strength wasn't optional, it was survival. Part 4. Blooding the young, killing before 10. The darkest truth of Viking childhood training is that some kids didn't just practice with weapons, they killed with them. There are accounts in the sagas of children joining raids as young as 10, sometimes even earlier. Their role at first might be to guard the ships, carry weapons, or finish off wounded enemies. But this wasn't passive. Killing wounded prisoners or delivering a final spear thrust was often a way to blood young boys to give them their first taste of killing. It sounds shocking, but in Viking culture, this was a rite of passage. A boy who had killed before adolescence wasn't just a child anymore. He was on his way to becoming a warrior. And in a world where warriors were the most respected men in society, this was the highest honor. Part 5. Girls in Training. While boys were the main focus of combat training, Viking girls weren't always exempt. Some were raised with the same harshness, especially in families that embraced the idea of shield maidens. Girls could learn to wield knives, defend the home with spears, and even fight beside men if the family or community demanded it. For most girls, their training was centered on survival, defending children, homes, and livestock during raids. But some sagas describe women and girls who took up arms and fought fiercely. These were rare, but the fact that they existed at all shows that violence was not reserved for males alone. Part 6. Preparing for a warrior's life. By the time Viking children reached their early teens, they weren't children anymore. They were hardened, armed, and ready. They could hunt, wrestle, fight, and kill. They had endured hunger, cold, and pain. And above all, they had been trained to see violence as natural. This was no accident. Viking society demanded it. A weak boy was a liability. A soft child endangered the family. Only the strong survived, and strength meant readiness to kill. The training was brutal, but it worked. And that's why Viking warriors, even those who were still barely teenagers, terrified Europe for centuries. Part 7. Raids through the eyes of a Viking child. Imagine you are only 9 years old, your hands still small, your body still lean. And yet, you are standing on the deck of a Viking longship as it cuts through the icy waters of the North Sea. The air is sharp with salt, your stomach churns from the waves, but your heart races for another reason. This is your first raid. For many Viking boys, this was no fantasy. By the time they reached 9 or 10, some were already taken along on raids. Their role wasn't to lead, of course it was to observe, to learn, and to contribute where they could. They hauled ropes, carried weapons, and guarded the ships when the warriors stormed the shores. But the most chilling part was this. They watched. They watched as fire consumed villages. They watched as their fathers and uncles cut down men, dragged off captives, and looted treasures. Some boys were ordered to stand over the defeated, sometimes to finish them off, sometimes to hold them down. It was terrifying, but it was also a rite of passage. The sagas describe how young warriors would return from their first raids with a sense of pride. Even if all they had done was strike a single blow against a helpless prisoner, that act was celebrated as proof they were on the path to manhood. For us today, the thought of a child learning to kill at 10 is unthinkable. But for the Vikings, it was not just acceptable, it was honorable. To delay it would be to risk raising a weakling, someone who could not protect his family or his people. And so, Viking children became familiar with death long before they understood life. Part 8. Rituals, oaths, and initiations into adulthood. Training was not enough. For Viking boys, there had to be a moment when they crossed the line, when they shed the last traces of childhood and were recognized as warriors. This transition was often marked by ritual. Some of these ceremonies were simple. A boy who returned from a raid with blood on his hands might be given a feast, his first horn of mead, and a place among the men at the fire. He was no longer a child, he had proven himself. Other rituals were darker. Archaeological evidence and sagas suggest that boys sometimes had to swear oaths on weapons, binding themselves to a life of loyalty, violence, and courage. To break such an oath would not only dishonor the boy, it would curse him and his family. There are also chilling accounts of initiation involving animal sacrifice. A boy might be asked to kill a goat, a pig, or even a horse, not just to prove his strength, but to show he could take life without hesitation. In some traditions, blood from the sacrifice was smeared on the boy's forehead or chest, marking him as one who was ready to kill. By the time these rituals were complete, there was no turning back. A Viking child was no longer treated as a child at all. He was a warrior in training, expected to fight, to raid, and, if necessary, to die in battle. Part 9. Psychological conditioning. Teaching children not to fear violence. The physical training of Viking children was brutal, but the psychological conditioning was just as important. Fear, hesitation, and pity were dangerous weaknesses. From a young age, Viking kids were trained to suppress them. They were told stories of heroes who faced overwhelming odds and never flinched. They were mocked if they cried, they were beaten if they showed weakness. To modern eyes, this seems cruel. But for the Vikings, it was survival. A child who feared death would never last in a shield wall. A boy who hesitated to strike would be cut down in battle. Children were encouraged to laugh at danger, to boast of courage, to admire killing as glorious, not horrifying. Even play was infused with this mindset, boys pretending to raid villages, girls pretending to defend homes, all reinforcing the idea that violence was the natural order of life. By the time they turned 10, Viking children were not just physically prepared to kill, they were mentally prepared to accept it, to see it as normal, to see it as necessary. This conditioning created some of the fiercest warriors Europe had ever seen, but it also robbed children of innocence. Childhood as we know it today barely existed in the Viking Age. Childhood at the edge of a sword. When we think of childhood today, we imagine school books, playgrounds, toys, and carefree days. But in the Viking Age, childhood ended almost before it began. For the sons and daughters of Norse families, life was not measured in innocence but in survival, and survival often depended on how quickly a child could learn to fight, endure pain, and suppress fear. The training of Viking children, especially boys, was not merely preparation for adulthood. It was an indoctrination into a culture of violence, one where war was constant, enemies were everywhere, and death was always close. To the Vikings, there was no such thing as protecting children from harsh truths. Instead, their philosophy was brutally simple. Better to prepare a child for hardship early than to risk them breaking in the face of it later. Let's step back and look at what this meant for a society. A world without safety nets. To modernize, the Viking practice of raising children to kill before the age of 10 seems monstrous. But we must remember the world they lived in. There were no police, no permanent armies, no government institutions to protect villages. Every man was a warrior, and every woman was part of the defense of the home. Families lived in scattered farmsteads, surrounded by forests and fjords that could conceal enemies at any moment. If raiders came, there was no one to call for help. You defended your family with whatever weapons you had, or you perished. For Viking parents then, the question wasn't whether to expose children to violence, it was when, and in most cases, when meant as soon as possible. Children were given knives almost as soon as they could walk. By 5 or 6, they were tending livestock, chopping wood, hauling water, learning skills that required toughness and resilience. And by 7, 8, or 9, the boys were learning to wield weapons. The line between child and adult blurred. A 9-year-old Viking boy might already be stronger and more capable than a pampered modern 15-year-old. It wasn't just expected, it was necessary. The loss of innocence. The consequences of this way of life were profound. Childhood innocence, as we define it today, barely existed. Games often mirrored battle. Stories glorified violence. Even lullabies contained warnings about war, hunger, and the need for strength. Think of what that meant for a boy growing up in Norway around the year 850. By the time he turned 10, he had likely watched animals slaughtered in rituals and feasts, seen his father or brothers return from raids, bloodied but triumphant, helped defend the homestead from rival clans or thieves, been mocked or beaten for showing tears, sworn oaths to uphold his honor and fight when called, perhaps even taken part in a raid himself, where he was ordered to strike down a helpless prisoner or watch as others did. By the standards of the Viking Age, this was normal, but by ours, it is almost unthinkable. The emotional cost. We often speak of the Vikings as fierce warriors, but rarely do we pause to consider the emotional cost of raising children this way. Yes, it created fighters who feared nothing, but it also created people who were scarred long before adulthood. Imagine a child of 9 or 10 killing for the first time. The shock, the confusion, the numbness, and yet instead of comfort or counseling, the child was praised, cheered, and elevated into the circle of men. This was how Viking culture worked. What we would consider trauma, they considered initiation. What we would call cruelty, they called necessity. This may help explain why Viking warriors were so terrifying to their enemies. They weren't just men hardened by years of training, they were people who had never known a life without violence. By the time they sailed to raid England, Ireland, or Francia, they had been conditioned since childhood to see killing as ordinary. Girls in the shadows. It's easy to focus only on Viking boys, but what about Viking girls? They too were trained from a young age not necessarily to raid, but to defend the homestead. A Viking girl could wield a spear or axe if needed, and sagas tell of shield maidens who fought alongside men. But more often, girls were trained in resilience. They learned to run households, manage farms, and keep families alive when the men were away for months at sea. They had to be strong because raids often left women and children vulnerable. Girls grew up knowing that if raiders attacked, they might have to fight, flee, or be taken captive. Like boys, they were hardened early not into killers, but into survivors. The contrast with our world. To appreciate just how different Viking childhood was, compare it to our world today. At age 9 or 10, modern children are in school learning math and science. They might be playing video games, riding bikes, or reading books. They are sheltered from the realities of war, shielded from violence, and allowed a long adolescence before facing the responsibilities of adulthood. The Vikings had no such luxury. For them, childhood was a training ground for survival. This is why their society thrived despite the constant dangers of their world. Children were not raised to be fragile, they were raised to be unbreakable. And though it came at a terrible cost, it also made the Viking people some of the most feared and formidable in history. What we can learn from the Vikings. Of course, we do not want to return to a world where children are forced to kill before the age of 10. But there are lessons we can learn from the Viking approach to raising children. The Vikings valued resilience. They valued toughness. They believed in preparing their young for the real challenges of life, rather than shielding them from everything difficult. While their methods were extreme, their philosophy contained a kernel of truth. Children who are challenged become stronger. Today, we often focus on comfort and safety-important values, yes, but sometimes at the expense of resilience. The Viking world reminds us that hardship can forge strength, and that courage is not born from luxury, but from struggle. The legacy of Viking childhood. So what became of these children who learned to kill so young? Many grew into the warriors whose raids reshaped Europe. Others became settlers, farmers, or traders, carrying with them the hard lessons of their youth. Some became leaders, jarls, and kings who commanded fleets and armies. Their legacy is still with us. The sagas, the myths, the stories of Viking bravery and brutality all trace back to this childhood training. The Viking Age may be long past, but its warriors were forged in childhood, and their memory endures 1,000 years later. The sword in the cradle. The mythic weight of childhood training. The Vikings did not raise their children in a cultural vacuum. Every lesson, every strike with a wooden sword, every scar carved into a boy's skin carried with it the echo of mythology. From the moment they could listen, children were told the stories of gods and heroes who endured suffering, loss, and violence, and triumphed through strength and courage. Thor was admired for his brute force and fearlessness, a god who never hesitated to strike down giants. Odin, who sacrificed his eye for wisdom, showed that pain was a price worth paying for knowledge and power. Tyr, who lost his hand to the wolf Fenrir, embodied bravery and sacrifice. These myths were not bedtime stories meant to comfort. They were psychological conditioning. A boy who heard the story of Odin's eye or Tyr's hand could not complain when his own training left him bruised and bleeding. To endure suffering was to walk in the footsteps of the gods. By connecting childhood hardship to mythic destiny, the Vikings made violence feel sacred. A 9-year-old who learned to kill was not just preparing for survival, he was living out the fate of his people. The pressure of honor. Perhaps the most powerful force shaping Viking children was honor. Honor was everything. It was the currency of reputation, the measure of worth, the shield of one's family name. A boy who showed cowardice brought shame not only upon himself, but upon his entire bloodline. This pressure was immense. Children grew up under constant judgment not only from parents, but from the entire community. If a boy faltered in training, others mocked him. If he showed weakness, he was reminded that his ancestors would be ashamed. For children under 10, the weight of this expectation was crushing, but it also forced them to grow fast. A Viking boy had to constantly ask himself, will my actions honor my father, my mother, my ancestors, or will they shame them? In this way, Viking society ensured that even children lived as though they carried the burden of history on their shoulders. First blood. What did it actually mean for a Viking child to learn to kill? While not every child struck down a man before age 10, many were forced into moments of violence that marked them forever. A boy might be asked to slit the throat of a goat or sheep as practice for battle. He might be ordered to kill a captured animal in ritual sacrifice, standing before his family and neighbors, expected to act without trembling. In darker cases, when raids brought home prisoners, boys might be commanded to deliver the killing blow, a brutal initiation into the world of warriors. Accounts from sagas and later chronicles hint at these practices where killing was as much a rite of passage as hunting or farming. Even if a boy was not asked to kill directly, he was made to watch. By witnessing executions, sacrifices, and battle wounds up close, he learned that death was not something to fear. It was something to embrace, something inevitable, something honorable if faced with courage. The role of mothers. It is easy to imagine Viking fathers as the ones driving their sons into early violence, but mothers played just as important a role. In Norse culture, mothers often taunted their sons if they showed fear. A famous motif in sagas is that of women urging their men, husbands, brothers, or sons to fight harder, to seek revenge, to never back down. To Vikings, women were not passive figures of gentleness. They were guardians of family honor. Mothers told their sons, better to come home in a shroud than in shame. For a boy under 10 to hear his mother call him coward for hesitating with a knife was devastating, but it was also motivating. Viking women sharpened their sons not with blades, but with words that cut just as deep. The child who could not kill. But what of those who could not follow this path? What happened to Viking children who resisted violence? Here lies the unspoken tragedy of the Viking world. Not every child was born with the heart of a warrior. Some were gentler, quieter, more inclined toward farming, crafting, or poetry. And yet, they too were thrust into the forge of violence. Some survived by redirecting their toughness into other fields. Viking poets, called skalds, often endured the same rigorous training, but their weapons became words, their battlegrounds the halls of kings. Skilled farmers, smiths, and traders were also respected, provided they could defend themselves when necessary. But those who truly rejected the warrior path risked isolation. To refuse to fight was to risk dishonor. In some families, such children were taunted as weaklings, pressured until they conformed, or left behind in the hierarchy of respect. We rarely hear their stories because Viking culture preserved the tales of heroes, not those who resisted violence. Yet, in silence, there must have been children who carried scars not from battle, but from being forced into a life that did not fit their spirit. Childhood and death. One of the starkest realities of Viking childhood is how close it always stood to death. Child mortality was extremely high. Many children did not live past the age of 5. Those who did were considered strong, tough, and chosen by fate. By the time a boy reached 9 or 10, he was already viewed as someone the gods had spared and thus someone who had a duty to prove himself worthy of that survival. Death was ever present. Viking children buried siblings, cousins, and sometimes even parents before they turned 10. They watched funeral pyres, saw graves filled with weapons, and learned from the start that life was fleeting. To kill before age 10, then, was not only about violence. It was about facing death head-on, proving to the community that the child understood life's harsh truth. Everything ends, and only courage matters in the face of that ending. The weight of memory. Imagine for a moment the long arc of a Viking's life. A man of 40 sitting by the fire might recall the first time he struck with a blade as a boy of 9. He might remember the trembling of his hand, the blood, the praise of his father, the fierce pride of his mother. For him, that moment was not just a memory. It was the birth of his identity. Every scar, every raid, every decision afterward traced back to that childhood initiation. A Viking was not simply born into war. He was shaped by it, forged by it, hardened before he even knew what life could be beyond it. That is the chilling legacy of Viking childhood, a lifetime of strength built upon the silence of stolen innocence. The modern lens. When we examine this history today, we do so with mixed emotions. On the one hand, it is horrifying to imagine children raised to kill, deprived of tenderness, trained in brutality. On the other hand, it is a reminder of human adaptability of how societies, no matter how harsh, will shape their young to endure. The Viking world teaches us that childhood is not fixed. It is cultural. It is shaped by necessity. And while our world now prioritizes protection and education, theirs demanded blood and steel. Both are reflections of survival, though survival looked very different across 1,000 years.